Now we're going to talk about African Americans and the comics, or it might be more accurate to say black people and the comics, because some of the people that we're going to be looking at are African but not American. Either way, the history of black comics creators and black comics characters is, it follows the same trajectory as the history of comics in general, just a little bit, a very little bit later in time as far as the comic strips go. Now, we talked about earlier George Harriman and his comic strip Crazy Cat. George Harriman was one of the most influential comic strip artists of the early 20th century. Crazy Cat's one of the most highly regarded comic strips. However, most people didn't know about George Harriman's racial heritage until decades after his death, because he kept it a secret. And there's a very good reason that he kept it a secret. He wouldn't be able to get work. He wouldn't be able to work as a cartoonist. Most newspapers wouldn't carry his comic strip if they knew that someone, a person of color, even if, as in George Harriman's case, it was, I don't know what the exact percentage is, but he had a black grandparent, something like that. It didn't matter. It's the one drop rule. Any black ancestry and you were, quote, colored. Well, this may come as kind of a surprise. Everyone's not aware of this, and it sounds kind of weird. But back then, during Jim Crow, there were white newspapers and black newspapers. Well, I mean, like I said, that may not seem to make sense. Is this some sort of segregation law that says black people can't work on mainstream newspapers? No, there was not. It was not a written law. It was an unwritten law. And not only working at the newspapers, but things of interest to the black community usually weren't carried in the deep back pages of the paper, if at all, and in most cases, not at all. So some African Americans started their own newspapers around the country that were geared toward the black communities in those cities. The most famous of these was the Chicago Defender. But like I said, I don't even know how many there were, but every major city had at least one, and even some middle-sized cities as well. Well, what this means is that since all the content was provided by people of color, that means the comic strips were too. And it was the Chicago Defender that in 1927, beginning in 1927, started to carry an entire comics section that was all by black artists. Now, the other newspapers, they might have, up to that time, they might have had a strip, or more likely, some individual cartoons by black artists, but they didn't have a whole area set aside. They didn't have the funny pages in the black newspapers until 1927. The Chicago Defender, like I said, they had several, and then other newspapers followed suit. That tells you that there was a lot of talent out there. The Chicago Defender carried things such as Bungleton Green by Leslie Rogers. Leslie Rogers had this comedy strip, one of several comedy strips that he did. Also, the adventure action strip Speed Jackson by Jay Jackson, which, as you can see there on the right, when it introduces the cast of characters, some interesting things about this one. May not be able to read the tiny print there, but the hero, Speed Jackson, what that little box next to him tells us about him. Speed Jackson of Howard University. That is a historically black college and university. Speed Jackson of Howard University and former track star taking postgraduate work at Oxford University in London, England. So this isn't just an action-adventure comic strip that features a black guy. It features a black guy who is also a grad student. One of the main characters is his linguistics professor. So this one lasted for many years. And another significant thing about Speed Jackson is that here in this early edition, his girlfriend was the school teacher Carmen Brooks. But later in the 1940s, he gets a white blonde girlfriend. And remember, these were not being run in mainstream newspapers, only in black newspapers. And no big deal is made of it. It's just very matter-of-factly included as part of the plot, and she is one of the recurring characters. Now, some of these black cartoonists over time, by the mid-1930s, the mid to late 1930s, were starting to break out. Kind of like what would happen in Negro League baseball. You know, there were some people that were really outstanding athletes, and eventually, when baseball was integrated in the late 40s, then some of those big stars who were still around were able to play in the official Major League Baseball, though many of them had played before that time and so didn't have that opportunity. Anyway, some black artists did have the opportunity to expand and get their strips picked up by the white newspapers, the mainstream newspapers. Probably the most prominent of those was this guy, Oliver Wendell Harrington, better known as Ollie Harrington, or often just All Harrington, O-L. He had a cartoon series called Dark Laughter that sort of cynically tackled some of the justice issues of the day. Here, this one on the right, you may not be able to see the little caption there, but the father is saying, "We better take this Christmas tree down soon. Otherwise, the landlord will think that we have something and raise our rent, jack up the rent." He also did an adventure strip called Jive Gray. And Jive Gray was an aviator. Remember those aviator adventure stories in the 1930s were very popular. There was also this one by Mel Tapley that was picked up by major papers. The adventure strip Jim Steele. Also, he had a comedy strip called Breezy that was about some adolescent characters kind of following their comic adventures. Mel Tapley eventually, in the 1940s, left the comics pages and transitioned to being a journalist and later an editor, working in Amsterdam, New York, his hometown, who actually he was the chair for a long time of the NAACP chapter in Amsterdam, New York, and I think in 1996 he got the Lifetime Achievement Award from the NAACP. And a couple of years ago, on what would have been his 100th birthday, the town of Amsterdam had a Mel Tapley Day. So these guys transitioned to having their strips carried by major newspapers. Now here's someone that is significant on more than one level. Jackie Orms, or her full name Zelda Jackson Orms. She went by Jackie. She did a long-running comic strip that was initially called Torchy Brown. And the character, Torchy, I think this started in 1937. The character was a young woman from a rural area. I think it was once implied that she was maybe from Mississippi. And she's in her late teens, like 18, 19, when the strip starts, who has gone to the big city She has moved to New York City and is living in Harlem. And so a lot of the comedy early on is about her naivete as a country girl in the big city. Also, there was a long running series of single panel cartoons that Jackie Orms did called Patty, Joe, and Ginger. And in this one, the little girl is saying, wouldn't it be interesting to figure out which committee it was that decided being colored is un-American? Well, like I said, that strip, maybe I didn't say this, that strip lasted a long time. And by 1950, when the romance comics trend had come and actually had already peaked by this time, the strip was called Torchy in Heartbeats, and it's really more of a romantic strip rather than just a a zany comedy kind of thing. Also, frequently in the Sunday editions of Torchy's Heartbeats, she would include these paper dolls for the kids to cut out and accessorize their paper dolls. Actually, Tarpe Mills did the same thing in Miss Fury, and then later, Jack Kirby was doing that, and other artists working at Timely and Marvel for the Patsy Walker and Millie the Model strips. All right, well, the representation of black people in these comic strips by black artists that mostly ran and I think every case started in the black newspapers, the representation of black people was not an extremely negative, stereotypical one, as you would imagine, right? But what was going on in the larger world of comic strips and then comic books, which came along, as you know quite well by now, in 1935, what was the case with how black people were being represented by white people? Well, one notable example of an African American character in a mainstream newspaper strip, a strip that would later become also comic books, was Lothar, and the comic strip was Mandrake the Magician. So Lothar, who is African, not African American, you can tell because he wears a fez, I guess. He is the sidekick to Mandrake the Magician. So this one is actually, for the time period, surprisingly well done. Now he wears this sort of leopard-skinned leotard, sort of like a circus strongman, and he's not maybe the brilliant tactical genius that Mandrake is, and he's kind of a servant character. All that is true, but his features are drawn fairly realistically rather than in exaggerated stereotypes, and he is portrayed as not only being very strong but also being very capable and very loyal. Nonetheless, he is a sidekick, and that is the main way that African American characters were being presented in the comics in the 1930s and 40s. In fact, in the comics, there were several black sidekicks, and they were no Lothar, I can tell you that. So, for example, the Spirit had a sidekick named Ebony White, and you can see the horribly caricatured stereotype that he is, and how he speaks and how he is drawn. Although he is portrayed as a very loyal character. I think he was a cab driver to start with. So you got that. Over in Young Allies, which debuted in June 1941, just 3 months after Captain America came out. Young Allies, I think I've talked about this one before when we talked about teen sidekicks. It was Captain America's sidekick, Bucky, and the Human Torch's sidekick, Toro. And they sort of got together a gang of kids, one of whom was called, well, his name was Washington Jones, but he was called Whitewash Jones. And that panel that I have, which is very offensive, that's the first speaking lines that Whitewash Jones had in Young Allies. Now, this character was written and co-created by Stan Lee, who was 18 or 19 years old at the time. This is right around the same time. Actually, a little bit before Simon and Kirby had quit, putting young Stan Lee in charge. So, over at Fawcett Comics, Captain Marvel, and remember, Captain Marvel was probably the most popular superhero of the World War II era. And we know that because his sales eventually surpassed the sales of Superman. He had a sidekick named Steamboat, who is much, much worse than Ebony White. He is a racially caricatured stereotype in his appearance and in his speech pattern, but much like Whitewash Jones, he's also a complete idiot. In fact, there's one story where Steamboat has I think it was a dream sequence, but he is able to become a superhero, by using the magic word like Billy Batson does, and he becomes the Harlem Marvel. And the name of the story is The Greatest Mistake Ever Made, because he is totally incompetent. An interesting story about the character and what eventually happened. In 1944-45, round in there, near the end of the war, a group of school kids from New York City, and it was an integrated group. That is, there were black kids, but there were also white kids, and there were kids of other racial origin, got together and protested this horribly offensive stereotype, which had also been singled out by the NAACP as being offensive. And they actually came, a group of, I think, like 50 or 100 school kids were led on a field trip by their teachers to come to the New York offices of Fawcett Comics and marched upstairs to the editorial offices to levy their protest. And the people in charge at Fawcett got the picture and relented, and they banned Steamboat. They wouldn't let C.C. Beck continue using Steamboat in the stories. Now, there's an article in which I think Roy Thomas is interviewing C.C. Beck much later, like the late 70s, where he was still complaining about, this term didn't exist then, but political correctness, and the fact that people were somehow offended by this character. Will Eisner also, who was a giant in the comics industry, never really, well, he did kind of apologize for Ebony White, but he was still a little bit defensive about it. Whitewash Jones, well, you didn't have to worry too much about him because the Young Allies didn't last all that long. By the late 40s, the superheroes were on their way out. In more recent years, Marvel has reintroduced and reclaimed the character in an interesting way. They sort of have him as a normal-looking black soldier who is deeply offended by the way that the comic books had portrayed him. Black characters who were not sidekicks during the Golden Age were then most likely to be African natives. Those were the two big categories where you would find black characters: sidekicks and African natives. Now, Tarzan had become so deeply embedded in popular culture by the 1940s, roughly 30 years or so after his creation, that for decades afterward, all the way up until when I was growing up in the 1970s, the very word native, especially with a capital N, would most likely be interpreted by the average American not as meaning an indigenous person to the United States or an American Indian, but to someone black from Africa, most likely from a village made up of thatched huts in the jungle. And so there was this conception that in darkest Africa, quote unquote darkest Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, that was the majority of people. That's how most people lived, which isn't true, but there was that perception. Now, here I've got on the right a page from the Tarzan comic book from Dell Comics from the late 1940s. And I also broke down and included one of those Jungal splash pages. Remember, I had said that I couldn't even find one that wasn't too offensive for me to feel comfortable showing. But, after showing Whitewash Jones and Steamboat and Ebony White, I figured I might as well get it all over with. The point here being that type of horrible racist stereotype that you see on the left was not the norm in the Jungle books. Really what you see on the right was more the norm. That is, African people being drawn realistically without the blackface appearance and without even the pidgin English often. But they were still secondary characters on their own continent, right? So Tarzan is like the ultimate white savior hero, raised by apes, and then he becomes the lord of the jungle and is in a higher position so far as his skills and the way he is presented than any of the people who are native to the continent. So, anyway, you saw a lot of these Jungle books, and we've already talked about them. We saw all the Jungle Girl books, and the fact we've looked at a couple of even sort of knockoffs of Tarzan of the male variety, like for example Khazar. Well, to summarize, right? So either horrible racist caricatures, such as you see on the left, or kind of implied inferiority because of their servile position, as you see on the right. That's what you would see in Jungle Comics in the 1940s and 50s, and even into the 60s and beyond. But there were a couple of significant occasions during the Golden Age era when you did see something a little bit different in representation of black people in Africa. And one of those was in the pages of this comic book, All Negro Comics, published by All Negro Comics, 1947, in Philadelphia. The guy behind it, the president of All Negro Comics Incorporated, was Orrin Cromwell Evans. You can see there on the right, the picture on the right, that is the front page. Actually, it's the inside front cover of that comic book, in which this new title is being introduced. Now, Orrin C. Evans was a journalist from Pennsylvania, and he had worked for a newspaper called the Philadelphia Record for some time. And in fact, he had been the only African American on the staff of that paper. It was not a quote unquote black newspaper. He was one of the first African American reporters to be on staff in a major city's newspaper that wasn't there to cover specifically black community things, but was just covering general news. Well, the newspaper shut down as a result of a strike. And Evans, who was very active in the NAACP and who contributed articles to The Crisis, which was the magazine of the NAACP that was edited by W.E.B. Du Bois, he thought that perhaps the message, the kind of message he would like to get out to people, could be conveyed through the pages of a comic book. And so he got a couple of his friends that he had worked with at the Philadelphia Record to invest and be partners with him to start this company that he was the president of, and he was also the editor of the comic book. Now, the title of the book, All Negro Comics, comes from the dual facts that all the stories were about black people and all the stories were by black people. And of course, there was a black editor. So all the scripters, all the cartoonists, all the artists, all the pencilers and inkers, the letterers, colorists, all that, all African American. Now, the way that it worked is that Evans worked with the artists to create the characters and the basic scenario for each of the several series that were going to be in this comic. And then the artists would script their own work. So those characters included Ace Harlem, there in the foreground wearing a fedora with an arrow through it. Ace Harlem was a private detective, a hard-boiled, gritty private detective operating in Harlem. And one of the other ones was an adventure strip called Lion Man. And there's Lion Man in the upper left-hand corner of the cover of the comic. And then there were several others as well. Couple of humor strips. So in this introduction, Evans, when he's describing basically what I just told you, it's like nothing that has been published anywhere before, and that was true. That was very true. He said that this publication is another milestone in the splendid history of Negro journalism, and it will glorify Negro historical achievements. He had this to say about Lion Man and his sidekick Bubba. Through Lion Man and Bubba, it is our hope to give American Negroes a reflection of their natural spirit of adventure and a finer appreciation of their African heritage. Now, I've described the layout of this and the various different series that were going to be a part of the book in sort of like the conditional sense, right? That would have been, were going to be. There was only one issue released of this comic book, and it didn't have a wide release. It was really only in the city of Philadelphia and in the environs. The hope was, by Evans and his partners, that it would be a success and would grow, and then they could get distribution to be able to get to delivered to other cities. However, despite all the hard work that was put into it by Evans and all the artists, there never was a second issue, and that's because, they didn't make enough money with the first one, kind of. But it's not really that so much, because really they did make enough money to justify a second issue and to continue to try. But the problem was that they couldn't get paper. they couldn't get newsprint. They couldn't get the cheap paper that comic books then were made out of because no one would sell them any in Philadelphia or anywhere in the area. They were blacklisted because of the nature of the magazine they were putting out. And as a result, the company failed and didn't get any further. So just the one issue. Now, at roughly around that same time, a couple of larger, more established companies were also making efforts to produce comics with African American themes geared toward African American audiences. And those included Parents Magazine Press, which is the publisher of Parents Magazine, which is still around. It's not a comic book, it's just a magazine for parents, right? They had the idea of releasing a comic book that they called Negro Heroes, True Stories, told in full color. And the very first issue featured Jackie Robinson, who was the Rookie of the Year. That was the year that he broke the color barrier and started playing in Major League Baseball. That's 1947. In 1950, Fawcett Comics, that's the company that did, remember Captain Marvel, they started a title called Negro Romance that was an attempt to cash in on the romance comic trend. Now, all Negro comics lasted only one issue. Negro Heroes lasted 2 issues. Negro Romance lasted 3 issues in 1950. Then in 1955, there was a 4th issue. By that time, it had been picked up by Charlton Comics, but there was never a 5th. So why did these 2 fail? One wonders if there were similar situations, particularly when similar to what happened in Philadelphia, right, with basically the powers that be kind of working together to keep it from happening, especially when you consider that in the mid-'60s, things like that were still happening. But it could also have been the fact that Negro Heroes was an educational comic. And, tell kids something is educational, and that's almost a guarantee they won't want to read it for fun. And the Negro Romance came out in 1950. The romance comics really hit their height in 1947-48, and were on the downward trend by 49. So maybe they just picked the wrong time to do it. Regardless, these efforts to gear something toward an all-black audience were very outside the mainstream for the time. And All Negro Comics, of course, was an independent company. They didn't have the kind of backing these other companies did. So just to stick to the theme, though, about jungle characters and African characters, let's take a closer look at Lion Man, which was drawn by Orrin Evans's brother, George Evans Jr., George J. Evans Jr., who drew it and would have also then therefore done, actually the whole thing. He would have done the script, probably the lettering and the coloring, but it would have been planned out with Orrin Evans. So let's look at the foreword here. American-born, college-educated, Lion Man is a young scientist sent by the United Nations to watch over the fearsome magic mountain of the African Gold Coast. Within its crater lies the world's largest deposit of uranium, enough to make an atom bomb that could destroy the world. Lion Man's job is to report on the doings of any treacherous nation that might seek to carry away any of the lethal stuff for the purpose of war. Now, that is not the typical subservient African character, right? So this is a character who has actually was born in the U.S., therefore he's an American citizen, college educated, and he's working for the United Nations. And he's there in sub-Saharan Africa on the Gold Coast to essentially protect the natural resources of that area, especially this metal found in a huge crater that people from other nations are going to want to steal. Most of those people, most of those other nations being non-African Western nations. So, does that sound familiar to you at all? If you saw the Black Panther movie, you'll know that it's very similar in layout to that. Now, that's not to say that Stan Lee and Jack Kirby lifted wholesale the idea from this book, because hardly anyone had heard of this book. It was just in Philadelphia and they didn't sell many copies. But still, this is about 20 years earlier than the arrival of the Black Panther in the late 1960s. And you've got an African character who is very much the main hero and who is very competent. Similar in a lot of ways to the comic strip character Speed Jackson. So it's interesting to think about what could have happened if George Evans had continued this series, had been able to continue it. Well, about 4 years after that, there was another example of a heroic African figure appearing in comics, this time from a mainstream company, Atlas Comics, of course, what would later be known as Marvel Comics, in the pages of Jungle Tales. And the character was Waku, Prince of the Bantu. Now, this is significant because he is the main character of the strip, and he is black. He's African. Now, he's not the star of the book. His series is one of several, because it's an anthology book, right? His ongoing series is one of several that appears. Jan of the Jungle, one of those jungle girls, she's the main feature. Nonetheless, the fact that you've got this African chieftain protecting his people from various threats in 1951 is noteworthy. Now, this one was not done by an African American artist. The person behind this was Ogden Whitney, who's a white guy that worked at Timely and then continued working for them when they were Atlas. Later on, in the 1960s, when they were Marvel, he did a lot of stories for S.H.I.E.L.D. But Prince Waku was kind of a forerunner of T'Challa, the Black Panther. And that brings us to the mysterious tale of Vuda, who was a jungle man character who first appeared in fall 1945 in issue 3 of Crown Comics, which was from the publisher Golfing McComb, that we haven't mentioned at all and probably won't mention again, because this is the only comic book that they did, although they did later publish the book Seduction of the Innocent. Anyway, Crown Comics was an anthology book, and Vuda first appeared in issue 3. The Jungle Man Vuda was created by Matt Baker, African-American artist that we've already talked about once in connection with his work on Phantom Lady during the Golden Age. All right, now, Vuda, 1945. He is apparently an African character, not a white guy who is doing a white savior Tarzan type thing with these African villagers. And that being the case, that would make Vuda, actually, since he came before Lion Man and 6 years before Waku, that would make Vuda the actual first black character to, the first black hero, comic book hero, really, and the first black character to have his own feature series. It wasn't the main feature. It wasn't the main feature, but it was one of the backup features. Except for the confusion. And the confusion comes from the fact that, there on the right, I have an example of Crown Comics. That's issue 19, the last issue that came out. Vuda first showed up in issue 3. Vuda first showed up on the cover in issue 5. And there he is, one of 5 times that he would appear on the cover, including issue 19. That's him too. You'll notice that he is a white savior Tarzan type guy on the cover. But then inside the book, he's black. So is that a matter of being fearful of having a black character on the cover, fearing that would hurt sales? If so, why didn't they just use some other character to put on the cover, which they usually did, right, in 14 out of the 19 times? Except that, there are some other things, other issues that people have raised. For example, people point out that although he is colored the same as the African characters, his facial features and his hair don't appear to be African. But someone could also point out that the African woman, who in the story is clearly supposed to be African, her facial features and hairstyle are kind of ambiguous as well. That's some people would argue that's just Matt Baker's style. They might also argue that the facial features and hair of the hero aren't that different from Matt Baker's own, actually. So that leads, like I said, to some disagreement and some confusion. And just to go even further with that, by issue 6, Vuda was not only white on the cover, he was white all the way through. So there on the right, that image on the right, the 2 Vudas, one from his very first appearance, and then the other one from one of his later appearances. So he becomes white inside, but he was white on the cover all along. Now, there are 2 different ways of looking at this, and there are 2 different approaches that comics enthusiasts, Golden Age enthusiasts, and comics historians take. One way of looking at it is that Matt Baker intentionally created an actual African character to be the jungle lord in Africa, but that the publishers perhaps were reluctant to have that on the cover and pretty quickly just got rid of the idea altogether and worked their way around to making him completely white in all of his appearances. That's one explanation. Another explanation could be that Matt Baker drew this character not intending him to be African, and the colorist got confused in those first couple of issues, and essentially all the people who were dressed like that colored them the same, but the cover was done differently by a different artist and different colorist, and then eventually on the interior of the book they got it to match up the way it had been intended to be with him as a white guy. So which of these theories is the right one? Problem is, we have no way of knowing. There's no record. There's no one. I don't know that there's anyone alive still that was working on this book at that time to enlighten anybody. So Vuda is maybe an African hero, or maybe he is another Tarzan clone. So here's what that all boils down to. Even beyond the context of jungle comics, just in the context of comic books in general, you can make a very strong argument that Lion Man, along with Ace Harlem, the noir detective, literally noir detective, were the first black heroes in a comic book. You could make that argument. Now, someone else could counter-argue, yes, but it was in a very limited print run comic that almost no one outside Philadelphia ever saw. But still, it's a first. One could argue that Prince Waku in 1951 from Timely, or they were Atlas, I guess, by then. Actually, that was right around the time they shifted. Anyway, Marvel. Prince Waku was the first black hero to have his own regular feature. He wasn't the main feature, and it wasn't his book, but he did have a backup feature in it. And you could definitely say that if Lion Man and Ace Harlem were the first black heroes in a comic book, that Waku was the first recurring black hero from a major company, which, all Negro Comics was not a major company. But then again, there's Vuda, who is kind of a big question mark. He may have preceded both of them, because he certainly did have a recurring role in the lead feature, because he was on the cover 5 times, but we're by no means certain he was black on purpose. So that's kind of a cipher. I think the best thing is to give some credit across the board to all 3 of these characters and their creators. Two of the 3 being created by African American artists. Maybe the strongest claim for having the first black hero in a recurring series would be Prince Waku. But again, not the main feature, and it wasn't his book. So those firsts will come later. But at least some of them will also involve Africa.